Everybody, Pastor Paul here. Listen, I'm not sure what day it is wherever you are listening to this. Maybe Thursday. Not sure quite what day it is here either. No, it's a lovely Tuesday early afternoon. We're at the Kilns. It's called that because it was used to be a place where bricks and mortar were made and crafted. But this was, of course, the home of C.S. Lewis. And one of the things that I've been talking about and that you may have even heard mentioned if you were at one of our C.S. Lewis classes is the nature of his relationship with a certain Mrs. Moore. In fact, I call it the curious case of Minto. Minto was his nickname for her. She was about 20 years older than he was and was the mother of one of Lewis's really close army friends. And they made a pact that if one of them perished in the war, if there was a surviving member, that they would indeed take care of the other person's parent. And that's what happened. Well, Mrs. Moore lived with Lewis almost her a good portion of her adult life, some 30 years. And some have even speculated about the nature of Lewis's relationship with Mrs. Moore. One of the interesting things, of course, is that many who love C.S. Lewis and come to his defense, understandably, and want to defend him, will hear no mention of this idea that Lewis might have had an inappropriate relationship with Mrs. Moore, if we don't like to think of our spiritual heroes in that way. Well, what's interesting, though, is that when you read and hear the accounts of Maureen, who was Mrs. Moore's daughter, who also lived with Lewis and Mrs. Moore was her mom, what she says leaves no doubt, really, to the nature of their relationship, and that it seems that for some 10 years or so, that Lewis indeed had a romantic relationship living together with this woman and her daughter that he kept secret from everyone. Well, of course, Lewis became a Christian in 1931, and we don't know the nature of their relationship at that time, but clearly over time, it became much more of a caretaking mother-son kind of relationship where Lewis was providing for her. Now, how are we to think about these things as Christians? I think one of the things that's important for us to note is that the gospel gives us permission to tell the truth about ourselves. It gives us permission to tell the truth about others. And one of the things that we come to learn in studying the life of C.S. Lewis is that, like us, guess what? C.S. Lewis was a human. He was a fallen human, a broken human, a sinful human. He had both good and bad in his life. And when we kind of come to terms with that, we can understand why it's the gospel that provides our only hope, not imitation of someone's life or idolizing someone or holding someone up on a pedestal. If we find that when we hear about one of our spiritual heroes or someone we've admired from a distance, having some kind of discrepancy in their life where their faith doesn't align with their behavior, it can shake our faith. And if it does shake our faith, that might be an indication that we've put too much hope into them versus into Christ. That's why the series that we're going through right now in the book of Colossians is so very, very important, because it reminds us that it is Christ in all, above all, through all, in all, and that it's okay to admit the truth about ourselves and about others because of Jesus. Now, with all that being said, let me just say, I think there's plenty of evidence to say that Lewis turned from the sexual nature of that relationship with Mrs. Moore over time, and that there was a whole host of fruits of the Spirit that accompanied Lewis's life that would indicate, of course, that his conversion was genuine. Let's not forget, Lewis took care of Mrs. Moore until the day she died in the late 40s. I mean, this was a man who was committed to caring for what, by was all accounts, a very difficult woman to deal with, who had become very sick, very invalid by the end of her life, that yet Lewis provided faithfully for her. We also know that Lewis was an incredibly generous person, and that he used this kiln, his home, as sort of a home base for ministry and hospitality. In fact, Lewis was seemingly oblivious to how much money he had, how wealthy he really was, because a majority of his money was put into this trust that was managed by others and dispensed to people who had need. And I think in a lot of ways, what Lewis does embody for us is this idea of self-forgetfulness. Tim Keller said that, the definition of humility is not thinking less about yourself, it's thinking about yourself less. And for Lewis, you just got the sense he didn't think about himself one way or the other. He had this marvelous gift of self-forgetfulness, would allow him to be present with people, allowed him to be this gracious host, allowed him to be generous, allowed him to fulfill a promise made to an army comrade some decades before that he could have easily given excuse for not fulfilling, but instead was faithful to that promise till the end. And it just again shows us the grace of God in C.S. Lewis's life, even as he battled like we do, his fallenness, his sinfulness, and his brokenness. And so I think this is a great example of where Lewis really embodies the gospel in a way that we can emulate.